Hello, podheads, and welcome back to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. This is your host for today, Kate Carter.
And I'm Holly Lamoureux.
And you know what? It's time for us to we're just gonna jump right in.
Get it poppin'.
Okay, so today's episode's one that I've actually been meaning to cover for a while now because it's unlike most any serial case that I've done before. Not only would it become one of the deadliest murder investigations in modern history, but it all unfolded behind the Iron Curtain, so inside of the Soviet Union, where government was not exactly eager to admit that a serial killer could even exist. For more than a decade, children, teenagers, young women, and young men disappeared from train stations, bus stops, city streets, and small towns across southern Russia and Ukraine. Their bodies would eventually begin turning up in forests and wooded areas, stabbed, mutilated, and in some cases, missing their eyes, tongues, nipples, or sexual organs. Investigators interviewed thousands of people. Innocent men were arrested, and one man was even executed for a crime he did not commit. And meanwhile, the real killer was questioned by police, arrested, released, and allowed to continue killing. By the time it was finally over, Andrei Chikatilo would be convicted of murdering 52 people, although he confessed to even more. And so I want to warn everybody now, this case does involve children, sexual violence, mutilation, cannibalism, and some extreme graphic crime scenes. And I'm not going to play down to what happened to these victims, so there's going to be some details in this episode that are difficult to hear and read out loud. And I do want to say, Mom, if you're listening, this episode ain't for you, okay? Go ahead and turn it off. We'll see you next week, all right? She ain't gonna like it. Okay, so I said it. Trigger warning, trigger warning, trigger warning. Feel free to stop at any time, but don't and listen to the whole thing because it's
Well, put it on
crazy.
mute. Put it on mute. Listen to the whole. You can like stop
Read
it,
it.
turn your
Yeah,
headphones down, go ahead and download the episode, and
right.
all the things. But yeah.
But this also isn't just the story of one unbelievably fucked up man. It's the story of completely overwhelmed investigation, a government that was reluctant to acknowledge what was happening, and detectives who spent years hunting someone they couldn't identify, and a killer who somehow managed to slip through their fingers more than once. This is the story of the Rostov Ripper, Andrei Chikatilo.
Whoa. Let me put my seatbelt on. One moment.
Bitch, get
The turbulence
ready.
have started. I'm getting scared.
I gave myself goosebumps just now and I wrote this whole damn thing. So,
I This is gonna be crazy.
okay, so quick history lesson. I know you guys love that, but it's kind of important. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, he was born on October 16th, 1936, in a tiny Ukrainian village of Yablochny. I want to go ahead and say because this case takes place in Ukraine and Russia, a lot of the names are going to be hard to pronounce. So forgive me for anyone listening that knows the language. I am doing my best.
That's all you can do.
This Andre was born only a few years after Ukraine had been devastated by the Holodomor, which is the famine that occurred in the 1930s. So basically, millions, and I'm not even kidding you, millions of people within 1 year were basically starved to death. And this was under Joseph Stalin's government. They took agriculture, grain, other food supplies, and basically left villages starving and without food. There are records stating that people had to eat whatever they could to stay alive. Children were being abandoned because there was no food for them, and there was lots of cases of cannibalism. And that last part becomes pretty particularly important to Andre's story because his mother once told him something absolutely horrifying. When Andre was a child, his mom said, "Oh, you used to have an older brother, but at some point he was kidnapped by the neighbors and eaten."
Oh,
Imagine telling Millie that.
yeah.
Millie, you used to have an older sister, but our neighbors ate her. Really mess up that child. It just gets
Hmm.
worse, too. Now, before you lose your mind, though, we don't really know if that's a true story. It's just kind of like it existed, but there was no ever like factual evidence that he had an older brother. But then again, we're in the 30s, so it kind of
Hmm.
just depends.
Yeah.
So, Andre's parents, their names were Roman and Anna. They were very poor. They were farm workers. And when Andrei was 4 years old, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And so his dad got drafted into the Red Army. He was eventually captured by German forces and was a prisoner of war. And strangely enough, because it's not that way at all today, but surviving being a prisoner of war was actually like a bad thing back then because Stalin saw that like if people were prisoners of war, they decided to be captured instead of like killing themselves. Like he preferred that these soldiers kill themselves and not be captured by the enemy. So, regardless, Andrei spent his earliest years surrounded by starvation, war, violence, poverty, and fear. And honestly, that's like the most I'm going to give you about the Soviet childhood portion of the story because I could just go on and on. But now Andrei starts to get a little weird. So by the time Andrei enters school, I think he's around 8 years old. He's very thin. He has horrible eyesight. He's like nearsighted galore. He's very socially awkward. He's 8 years old and has no education. And he's horribly timid. He also is reportedly still wetting the bed, which is kind of a no-no at 8. And his mother used to punish him horrifically for this. Other kids in school would also bully Andrei, and this was because he never fought back. He was just one of those kids that didn't. But academically, he did really well. Um, in fact, his eyesight was so bad he couldn't actually see the front of the class. So what he did to compensate is he would go home and just study and memorize large amounts of information at home so that he succeeded in school. So teachers, I know, isn't that, well, don't say oh yet.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's hard
He
because
has
it's always like they start out so sad, you know?
Yeah, you're like, oh my God, you have a horrible life. I feel bad for
Yeah.
you. Well, so basically, there were like two different versions of Andre developing at the same time. He was this intelligent kid, very smart, teachers loved him. And then he had the deeply insecure, humiliated kid that everyone tortured him about, pretty much. And then puberty entered the chat. So, as Andre got older, he realized that although he could become sexually aroused, he had issues maintaining that sexual arousal. And so he was terrified that the girls at school would find out that he could not be sexually active and like make fun of him for that too. So, instead of developing these like normal teenage relationships that everybody had, he mainly avoided them and he avoided girls. So, that's kind of like another notch that kind of sucks for him. This is where shit starts to get a little weird. According to Andre himself, he encountered an 11-year-old girl who was friends with his younger sister. This is just randomly while he was in school. I think he was around the age of 17 or 18, so he's like grown. He had an 11-year-old girl, at one point decided to grab her, wrestle her to the ground, climbed on top of her, and while she was struggling and screaming underneath him, he ejaculated almost immediately on top of her. No sex, no sexual stuff happening. So, for the first time, Andre's sexual arousal, physical domination, fear, and violence kind of all came together. I mean, I can't really tell you that this one incident created a serial killer because that's not how human behavior works. But Andre himself would later describe violence as being very intimately connected with his ability to like achieve that release. And so eventually, when you find out, because you will, what he does to his victims in the future, this encounter he had with his sister's friend becomes very difficult to ignore. He has sexual issues, anyways, so the fact that like he was trying to hurt a girl and that's what made him, you know, it
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So after high school, Andre attended a vocational school and he studied communications technology. And then in 1957, at 21 years old, he began his mandatory service in the Soviet military. He was in the military until about 1960, and from the outside, there wasn't really anything particularly like remarkable about him. He completed his service, he joined the Communist Party, and afterwards he moved to a place this is called the Rostov region. And I'm going to speak about that a lot. Everything that happens in the story is in the Rostov region. And there he found work as a telephone engineer. So this is where you kind of think his life's going to go off the rails, but it doesn't. Instead, it kind of gets weirdly normal. Andrei's younger sister, Tatiana, eventually came to live with him, and she apparently looked at her awkward, painfully shy, chronically single brother and decided that somebody needed to help him. So she introduced him to a woman named Fianna. Don't know how this happened, but it worked. Andrei and Fianna ended up marrying after 2 weeks of meeting each other in 1963. Red flag, Fianna.
I love the timeline of people's marriages back in the day. Like two
Right, get it
weeks,
done. Get it
put a
done.
ring on it. Two
Yep,
weeks.
good enough. So this marriage brings us to a question, obviously, is, how the hell is this man getting married if he can't have sex? And apparently, very easily, Andrei's lack of
Inability.
inability, yes, of activities, sexual activities, did not disappear after marriage. Regular intercourse remained extremely difficult for him, but somehow they ended up having two kids together, a daughter and a son. At some point, Andrei ended up becoming a teacher, which is like not good. In the early 1970s, after studying Russian literature, Andrei began working in schools. And considering everything that we know about the incident that happened with the 11-year-old girl, I think we can all agree that he should not be a teacher, but nobody knew that at this point. But it didn't really take long for problems to start. Complaints started surfacing about Andrei behaving inappropriately with students. Accounts of exactly what happened vary, but he was definitely accused more than once of touching children, particularly girls. And there were reports of him entering the girls' dormitory areas and attempting to grope them as well. So, no nos. But instead of like one dramatic moment where everybody kind of realized what kind of man he was, he basically just bounced back and forth to different schools and different teaching positions so that people wouldn't really realize what was happening. And yet, Andrei still wasn't the horrible monster that people would later see in photographs. To most adults around him, he was still this awkward, quiet, weak, weird man. A man that students openly mocked at school and disrespected. Apparently, he struggled to control his classrooms, and kids reportedly made fun of him because they knew he wouldn't do anything about it. So, just like how he was as a child. But sexually, something was changing. The same man who struggled to perform discovered that this humiliation, resistance, fear, physical domination aspect was helpful to him. And that is the version of Andrei Chikatilo that we need to keep in our heads as we get to 1978. So Andrei is now 42 years old, wife, two kids, and spent years working around other people's children. Love that. And he's already been accused of sexually inappropriate behavior towards students. And somewhere beneath this completely like unimpressive exterior is something brewing that's been developing for decades or his whole life. On December 22nd, 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakatova disappeared. Yelena was often called by her nickname Lena, and she lived in a town, it's called Shakti. It's a city in the Rostov region where Andrei was working and living. Lena had been walking through town when she encountered Andrei. Now, exactly how he approached her has always been described differently, but ultimately he ended up persuading the 9-year-old girl to go with him to this small rundown house nearby. I want to say it's not even a house, it's like a shack. It was like a one-bedroom, disgusting shack. And apparently he had purchased this in secrecy. Like nobody knew that this shack was his. It basically looks like the way articles described it, it was like a homeless shack. Like it wasn't like a running water or anything like that.
Mhm.
It was a room. And I need you to remember that too, because Andrei had kids and wife at home. The shack was somewhere else. It wasn't his home. And once inside, Andrei later said that he attempted to sexually assault Lena, but because of his lack of ability, he couldn't. The 9-year-old fought him. She screamed, and during that struggle, something happened to Andrei that you can probably already guess is happening. It helped him, and he kept attacking her. Andrei strangled Lena and stabbed her repeatedly. Later accounts would describe him experiencing multiple things during the attack, though she was never raped, and he ended up stabbing her over and over and over again over 66 times. Lena was only 9 years old. Afterwards, Andrei took her body from the shack and dumped her in a nearby river, and then he went home to his family because he's a fucking psychopath. Lena's body was discovered 2 days later. Now, obviously, when a 9-year-old child disappears and turns up murdered, horrifically, police start looking up every adult who's been around her when she vanished. And here's where this story becomes a little frustrating because almost immediately, investigators had a reason to look at Andrei. A witness reportedly saw Andrei with Lena right before she disappeared. So the police questioned Andrei about it, and somehow he just walked away. In fact, his wife provided an alibi for him. So I don't really know where the wife came in and was like, yeah, he was here, blah, blah, blah. So for that reason, investigators actually ended up turning their attention towards another local man named Alexander Kravchenko. Alexander was not some random innocent man, I will say. He had actually been previously convicted of rape and murder, so horrible person. But there was a big problem. He hadn't murdered Lena. Investigators pressured Alexander until he confessed, though. And later, Alexander did withdraw his confession, but the Soviet authorities were like, no, too late. So he was convicted of Lena's murder, and in 1983, he was executed. Which, teach their own. He could have been worth executing anyways. Sounds like he was a horrible person, but he didn't commit that murder,
Yeah.
So, the actual killer, though, still out and about living his life. And maybe that close call scared Andrei because after Lena's murder in 1978, there's a gap in his known killing spree. So, for nearly 3 years, nothing happens. But while he may not have been killing, his life was still very unraveling. By early 1981, Andrei's teaching career was over. The allegations of inappropriate sexual behavior around students had followed him long enough that finding another teaching position became really difficult, so he decided to take a different job. And he ended up getting a job in Rostov as a supply clerk for a factory. And on paper, sounds really boring. This job ended up being maybe one of the worst things that could have happened because being a supply clerk required Andrei to constantly travel, on trains all over the place, if you catch where the story is going. So Andrei began taking trains and buses, and he was going throughout the Rostov region and beyond, traveling to factories, warehouses, markets, and other cities to obtain materials for his employer. Suddenly, this man, who had already murdered a child, had a completely legitimate reason to be traveling and spending hours at train stations, carrying a bag, traveling alone, and disappearing for stretches of time without anyone questioning where he was. To make matters worse, Soviet train stations were filled with the exact kind of people that Andrei would learn were easiest to isolate, pretty much. You've got runaway kids, you've got people traveling alone, teenagers traveling alone, you've got sex workers, homeless people, kids who had missed trains or buses. Andrei didn't need to break into people's houses to do what he was going to do. He didn't need to stalk families or really even know who his victims were. He just needed to find someone who was alone. And on September 3rd, 1981, he did. And her name was Larissa Chikatilo. Larissa was 17 years old at the time and a student at a boarding school. Andrei found her near a bus stop in Rostov and convinced her to walk with him for a little bit and ended up walking her down a secluded area near the Don River. According to his later confession, he suggested that they were going to drink vodka and relax together. Very Eastern European shit, drink vodka. But once they were far away enough from people, Andrei obviously attacked her. And this murder is important because you can almost imagine Andrei telling himself, oh, I just spiraled out of control. But he ended up attempting to sexually assault a child. She fought back. He panicked. He killed her. And then with this story with Larissa, Andrei threw her to the ground, tore at her clothing, attempted to have sex with her. Once again, couldn't. And Larissa was really fighting. She was much older. And so the struggle appears to have triggered something in him. And so he began beating and strangling her. To stop her from screaming, he forced dirt and leaves into her mouth because they're out in the open. And because he apparently had not brought a knife with him that day, he used what he could find around him. Investigators would later find evidence that Larissa had been attacked with a large stick and that Andrei had ended up mutilating her body with his teeth, biting off
Oh my gosh.
organs. Yep. Yeah, I don't need to tell you what organs for you to just figure it out. Biting off body parts. And when he was finished, he covered her body loosely with leaves, branches, and scraps of newspaper and just walked away. And Larissa's body was discovered the following day. Here's a question I got for you. First of all, this is out in the open. Nobody gonna see or hear her. Second of all, the dude's gotta be covered in blood, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't like if he's biting off body part, like I can't even imagine it's not clean.
Oh,
Yeah. And if there had been any question after Lena's murder about whether Andrei was capable of killing again, obviously now um, there wasn't. So with Larissa, the problem was that nobody knew these murders were even connected, though, you know? So Andrei disappeared back into his completely ordinary life, and 9 months passed. And then on June 12th, 1982, Andrei was traveling by bus through the Rostov region for work when he encountered another kid. This time her name was Luboy Biervirk, and she was 13 years old. Luboy had been shopping and walking home when Andrei eventually began walking beside her. For a while, nothing happened. They just simply walked next to each other. Eventually, the road became more isolated and bushes shielded them from view. And that's when Andrei attacked. He dragged Luboy back into the bushes, tore at her clothing, and stabbed her repeatedly. When her body was eventually discovered on June 27th, more than 2 weeks later, the medical examiner documented 22 knife wounds to her head, neck, chest, and pelvic area. But there was something else. This time, there were injuries around her eyes as well. At the time, it was just simply like another horrific part of an already horrible crime scene. But investigators did not understand that the eyes were going to end up becoming one of the signatures of Andrei. So from here, the pace starts changing. And because Andrei wasn't waiting another 3 years anymore, he wasn't even waiting 9 months. The periods between the murders were beginning to shrink. So later that same year, another child disappeared. This time it was 9-year-old Olga Stalmechnuk. Can I just say I'm also really proud? You're gonna hear a million names, all Ukrainian or Russian names. I'm very proud. I literally practiced all of these names. So I'm giving
yeah,
myself a pat on the back.
that's very impressive. Also, you can say
Thank
them
you.
wrong and I will never know.
You're right. You're right. But I hope somebody on YouTube's gonna be like, she didn't pronounce it right.
Yeah. Oh, they will. They will.
So Olga vanished while riding a bus home from dance lessons in November 1982. Her body would not be discovered until months later in April 1983, just in a field outside of a city. And from what investigators found when they recovered Olga, it made it increasingly difficult to believe these were random, unrelated murders. Olga had been stabbed dozens of times. Her body had been mutilated, her abdomen was cut open, her eyes had been taken out. Again, by the beginning of 1983, investigators were looking at several murdered children and young women across the Rostov region whose bodies had been abandoned outdoors, subjected to horrible levels of violence, but they were all different ages, different locations, different circumstances. But the wounds were kind of telling, like they all kind of had similar wounds, similar attacks.
Yeah.
Finally, someone started to notice something. So, his name is Major Malik Festistov. He was a Moscow investigator. He was brought in to oversee the growing investigation. Now, Major Malik, another tongue twister, began looking at the cases that previously had been treated as individual, and he realized something that Soviet authorities were deeply uncomfortable acknowledging at this time. He was the one that brought up the idea of this might be a serial killer. And I know that sounds obvious because we're obviously sitting here 40 something years later, talking about an episode called the Rostov Ripper. But at the time, this idea was like a huge problem. In the 1900s, Soviet ideology basically liked to present, well, they liked to present themselves in multiple ways, but one of the things was violent serial killers basically would have been a system of being corrupt. And, according to the Soviet Union, like, they're not corrupt. What are you talking about? They were supposed to have eliminated this kind of conditions that created predators like Andrei. So they didn't think that people like Andrei existed, but someone forgot to tell Andrei that, you know.
Okay.
He was
Interesting.
born he was born into a shitty world. So investigators were dealing with two problems at the same time. They had to find a man who was leaving mutilated bodies across a giant geographical area. And then
Hmm.
they had to operate inside a system that wasn't really excited about the idea of a serial killer. The investigation that developed would eventually become known as Operation Forest Path. All English words because the Russian word for it was really long. And one of the men assigned to it was a man named Viktor Burakov. So we will talk about Viktor Burakov throughout the story, and I'll remind you who he is later on. But Victor basically spends years chasing down Andrei. So at first, investigators barely knew what they were chasing. They began comparing crime scenes, doing the autopsy findings, locations, even victim profiles. Many of the bodies had been found near transportation routes like the railroads, the bus stops, the trains, or in wooded areas found within walking distance of those places, which is a huge clue. Their killer was mobile. He either traveled frequently or he understood the railway system enough to know what he was doing. They also realized he wasn't really particularly selective when it came to gender because girls and young women were mostly being attacked, but boys were going to be eventually become victims too. So, what mattered the most was that vulnerability aspect we talked about earlier, where all of his victims were alone in that moment. Like they didn't have people with them. People who could be convicted to fall an adult, without attracting any attention, those were his type of victims. And once Andrei got them away from other people, just like maybe standing in the train station, the attacks were becoming very ritual at this point. Stab, mutilate, target sexual organs, attack the eyes, bite the victims, remove the body parts. And in later confessions, Andrei would claim that he occasionally, love this, chew or swallowed pieces of flesh that he removed from the victims. So,
Is he doing
yes.
this like all out somewhere else, like where he attacks them? He's doing this, or is he like taking them
No,
out?
no, it's
Like,
out in the open.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have arrived at cannibalism. It's
Hmm.
coming back in the story. And obviously, you remember the story his mom told him as a child, brother kidnapped and eaten. I'm not saying that story caused this because that would be a big leap, but the fact that cannibalism appears at both ends of Andre's story is kind of crazy. You don't just do cannibalism. That's like something
It's just like
you
something you just don't just do.
you just don't do it.
You just don't do it.
You really shouldn't. It's not okay.
No, no, it's not.
No.
You shouldn't. Like, you
It's
just
not
shouldn't do
accepted.
it.
It's not
Mm-mm.
acceptable. And so by the summer of 1983, Andre was on a killing streak. One victim was a teenage girl named Laura, we're just going to keep it at that, whom he ran into while traveling. Her body was left in a woodland near the railway. And then there was a 7-year-old named Igor Gudkov. This was Andre's first male victim. Wouldn't be his last. And I don't want to diminish any of these victims because I hate doing that. We hate doing that at Over My Dead Pod. I don't want to diminish any of their stories, but I've got 54 names to go through. And so I might just say their names and their age at some point and just go with it, okay? You know what's going to happen to them in their body. I don't need to say it every single time. I think the ages are more appropriate than anything of what you want to like pay attention to. So, okay, so we've got the 7-year-old Igor, his first male victim. And then there was 19-year-old Vera, 14-year-old Sergei, children and teenagers They were disappearing near bus stations and railroads, walking away with a stranger, eventually being discovered horrifically. And by now, investigators knew they had something happening, but knowing it and stopping it are obviously two very different things. What were they looking for? Like a predator, already convicted murderer, a psychiatric problem person, a transient? I mean, the list could go on. Thousands of people would eventually be questioned, and Soviet interrogation, as you can imagine, are not for the weak. People were confessing left and right to shit they hadn't done, and investigators were getting lots of false admissions. So there were suspects upon suspects and people accusing each other, and every hour spent chasing this confession that probably wasn't true was another hour that like Andrei was out doing his own thing. And like I've said before, he didn't really look like a monster either, but that's kind of like depending on your definition of monster, because to me, I'm like, he gives me creepy vibes. He was a school teacher, like he had sexual issues. Well, they wouldn't really know that out front, but he was part of the Communist Party. He traveled for business reasons. And when Andrei walked through a railway station carrying his work bag, nobody saw him as Rostov Ripper. They saw some awkward middle-aged guy going to work. And then 1984 happened, and if investigators thought the murders were already out of control, they had no idea what was coming, because 1984 would become Andrei's deadliest year.
Were people starting to catch on and think that
No,
there's a killer on the loose? There's just
no.
not that, there's no communication back then, so I feel like it's very hard to
Well, we're
even,
in the 80s, so there's
yeah.
communications. There's
Well, I mean, like,
communications.
there's not, nobody is connecting the dots when they're in different locations. There's no communication between, like, jurisdictions like there is today, is what I mean.
Okay, so the way it worked in Rostov, though, because this is still not today's society in the Soviet. So in the 1980s, totally communication, but there wasn't really different regions. It was the Rostov region, which is huge. So it's different police forces back then, but their issue is it was not formally recognized and didn't want to be formally recognized that this was a serial killer. So they were searching for individuals
Mm-hmm.
for each one of
Okay.
these murders. Even though some of the investigators, like I talked about, like Victor, were like, hey guys, this is a serial killer. Like they didn't
Yeah.
want to believe that.
Well, the idea of serial killers wasn't even really popular at that time.
Though they were quite well around.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about 1984. Huge year. This is when the case totally exploded. So Andre had already killed multiple people at this point. Investigators were starting to understand that maybe some of these bodies belonged to the same crime family, and
Hmm.
yet nothing was really done. In January and February alone, two women were murdered in Rostov. They were murdered in a park, so the same park, that became significant enough that investigators were like, wait a minute, parks, wooded areas, maybe there is something happening. On March 24th, Andrei was in Novoshakhtinsky, a town, when he noticed a 10-year-old boy named Dmitry Pashnikov near a stamp kiosk. Now, Dmitry, this little 10-year-old, was collecting stamps. And Andrei apparently used that as a completely innocent hobby to get the little boy talking to him, pretending that he was like interested in stamps too. It was such a great way to gain a child's trust that it almost makes it worse. Dmitry wasn't dragged from a street screaming or forced into a car. It was a little boy who loved stamps and had simply met a friendly adult who loved them too.
Strong.
Really hurts my heart. Here's the thing with Dmitry. People did see them together. Several witnesses saw Dmitry walking with this strange middle-aged man, and it became incredibly important once the child disappeared. Andrei led Dmitry away from the populated area and eventually attacked him, strangling, mutilating, and abandoned his body. Dmitry was found days later, and the crime scene gave investigators more than just another horribly mutilated child. This time, police discovered a footprint that they believed belonged to the killer, and semen, and saliva. Even better, the witnesses who had seen Dmitry before he disappeared were already able to give police a pretty reasonably detailed description of the man that was walking beside him. So for once, they weren't working like entirely backwards from a decomposing body in the woods. Someone had actually seen the killer with the victim. But it gets really bad, so it's not like that really helped much. 2 months later, on May 5th, Andrei murdered his oldest victim, 29-year-old Tatiana Petrosyan, and her 10-year-old daughter, Svetlana. And this one's pretty disturbing because Tatiana wasn't some random person he'd spotted at a train station. She actually knew him. According to the accounts of the investigation, Tatiana had known Andrei for several years, meaning that there was already that level of them knowing each other. And she and Svetlana accompanied him to a wooded area outside of Shakti, near a train station. Like they knew him, so they were just walking with him. Whatever Tatiana thought they were doing that day, she had no reason to believe that he was taking her daughter along to like kill both of them. But once they were isolated, Andrei attacked Tatiana. 10-year-old Svetlana witnessed, and he murdered Tatiana. Svetlana ran, and this little girl, 10 years old, actually made it almost a mile before Andrei caught up with her. Imagine getting chased for a mile. Like, shoot me now. Caught up with her and ended up killing her with a hammer. Her decapitated body was discovered on July 5th, and Tatiana, the mom's, remains weren't formally identified until the following year. So after their murders, everything came so quickly. So if I told you every single one of them from the beginning to the end, we would kind of just lose sight of what was happening. And I hate to say that, but 21, I'm just gonna get a little into it. So 21-year-old Yelena, she was murdered in June, later found stabbed beneath leaves and branches. 31-year-old Dmitry disappeared on July 10th while he was on his way to obtain a health certificate so he could go to summer camp. His mutilated body was discovered in a cornfield. 9 days after Dmitry disappeared, a 19-year-old student named Anna vanished while returning home from a dental appointment. By the end of July, another young woman had been killed. Then on August 2nd, a 16-year-old Natalia disappeared while visiting her sister. 5 days later, Andrei killed a 17-year-old, Louis, after approaching her at a bus stop and offering to show her how to get to Rostov's bus terminal. It's very good to notice that Andrei didn't really need a genius kidnapping strategy. Like, sometimes all he had to do was just offer directions or help. And then Andrei decided, oh, you know what? Maybe I won't stay local. Maybe I'll take my killing spree on a trip. So in August, his job ended up bringing him more than 1,000 miles away to the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, which is now known as Uzbekistan. So now we're in Uzbekistan. And instead of the murder stopping because he had gone away from Rostov, they just moved with him. Investigators later attributed him to the murder of an unidentified young woman who was decapitated and discovered near a river. And shortly after, a 10-year-old, Amrakal, a runaway, who was killed after Andrei encountered her on a bus. And that ends up being an important development because it showed that, like, the geography of this investigation is in a different country now,
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what you were talking about earlier, like, how did, was there not communication and shit? Well, he was just all over the place.
Yeah.
Dude was just killing people.
Yeah.
Police
it's
were,
just like we
yeah.
talked about last week with, my serial killer that was just like a transient, person moving around that it's just harder to catch those kinds of people,
It
obviously.
is.
For obvious
You
reasons.
can't
Yeah.
you can't do that thing where you get a whiteboard, put it on a map of a city and draw those little pinpoints. Like
Yeah, you
this
don't
is
know where
like,
they're gonna pop
let's
up.
get the world map and see where he's going next. Andrei eventually returned to the Rostov region and he continued. We have an 11-year-old Alexander who was murdered by the Don River in August. His body was found a few days later. 4 days after that, 24-year-old librarian Irina disappeared while she was on her way to a sauna. Andrei killed her in a different park. By this point, the sheer volume of murders committed by 1984 had to force police to dramatically increase surveillance. especially around bus stations, the railroads, other transportation hubs. Investigators were putting plainclothes officers into these areas and watched for men who seemed unusually interested in children, teenagers, or young women. And that is how, after years of bodies turning up and thousands of hours of police work, investigators finally laid eyes on Andrei while he was actually behaving like a predator. So on September 13th, 1984, two undercover detectives at a Rostov bus station noticed this strange middle-aged man repeatedly attempting to approach young women. Instead of immediately confronting him, though, they followed him, which I always think is smart. And the longer they watched, the worse it got. Andrei wandered through the Rostov, approaching women, following them, behaving sexually inappropriate in public. Accounts of the surveillance described him engaging in a behavior which I had to look this up, but they said he was behaving in a frauderistic behavior type, which basically means he was like rubbing up against women for sexual gratification. Straight to jail.
Yeah.
Dirty boy. So eventually he made his way to Rostov's Central Market, where police finally arrested him. I remember Dmitri, that 10-year-old stamp collector. So
Yeah.
investigators now looked at Andrei and realized that his physical appearance matched what those witnesses had given of the man that was seen walking with Dmitri shortly before his murder. So they had found someone behaving exactly like the predator they were hunting, someone who physically resembles the man, and then they searched his belongings. And I swear to God, if you handed me a list of what was in this man's backpack and you don't even have to tell me anything else about him, I would still have questions. Because inside his backpack, investigators found a knife with a blade approximately about 8 inches long, which is comes up, several lengths of rope, and a jar of Vaseline.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, you had a knife, rope, and Vaseline in your backpack. Nothing else, dude. It's like the story's made up. But of course, Andre had explanations for those three items. The knife was something he used for ordinary purposes, like traveling, um, for his safety. The
Like
rope,
traveling. Oh, okay.
the rope was used for tying packages to send to his employer, and the Vaseline, well, it's obviously wasn't illegal, but he said that it was for sexual purposes. So,
What, why? Why can't you just say you have dry skin?
right, my elbows are dry.
Like, what?
My elbows are
You're
dry.
offering things that you don't have to.
You don't
Okay.
have to. So obviously, none of those objects independently proved murder, but put them inside a bag together of a sexually
It's
inappropriate man who resembles the last person seen with a murdered kid.
he's
And he
hit the
was,
trifecta.
and he's in a bus station prowling on women and touching himself. I mean, to me, that's a
Walk him up.
suspicious kid. Lock him up. Straight to jail.
Hmm.
So they ended up, investigators were like, let's look up this dude. So they found the old allegations of him with students. They also discovered that he was already under investigation for stealing materials from one of his employers, which he stole two rolls of linoleum, which sounds very insignificant compared to what like people and police were suspecting him of. But it gave them something useful. At least they could lock him up for stealing
Hmm.
until they could investigate further, which we love. But then police took his blood. And this is the moment in the Andre investigation that makes me want to like put my head through a wall, basically, because remember the semen investigators had found earlier on one of the victims?
Hmm.
Forensic testing had led them to believe that the man committing these murders had a type AB blood. And so, which I didn't even know you could get from semen. So police tested Andre and they were waited for that result. He was type A, not AB. So suddenly, this man who looked like their witness description had a history of sexual misconduct around children, had just been caught doing weird sex stuff out in the open, carrying a knife, rope, and Vaseline, did not match one of the most important pieces of potential evidence they had. So they couldn't pin the murders on him. The explanation traditionally given in accounts of the case is that Andre was described as a non sequitur, or basically that his bodily fluids produced misleading blood group results, which I didn't know that that was a thing.
Never heard of it.
Um, Also, some researchers just say that the original semen type was just wrong, maybe. So, like, who knows? But what we know, like, to give them credit, the police did not F this up. It was just something that happened. Either way, the practical consequence in 1984 was the same. Investigators believed the killer's biological evidence pointed to AB blood. The man sitting in front of them had a type A. So, in a world that didn't have that routine forensic DNA profiling, that was a big difference, you know? They had him, but they literally had Andre sitting in front of police custody. They had witnesses. They had his history, his creepy fucking bag. They had officers who had personally watched him being a weirdo. And then there was science. So, more accurately, police had still had this theft case, you know? So, Andre didn't really roll out of the station that afternoon. He was still prosecuted from stealing property from his employer. He ended up being expelled from the Communist Party, and he was sentenced to a year in prison.
A year?
But he only served 3 months. And
Oh,
he
okay.
he was released on December 12th, 1984.
Hey, what's the explanation for that? Wait, what? A
What?
year?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Because he stole two things of lino.
Oh, so they're not, they just can't prove anything else at this point, so they're just locking him up for that. I see. I see.
Yes, 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 yes,
I
yes.
see. I see. I thought you were going to say for all of that. I was like, wow.
Oh, no, 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 no. So he
Gotcha.
just stole the two rolls of linoleum, got locked up for a year,
I
spent
see.
3 months in prison. He spent the end of his most deadliest, like, killing spree in prison, but not because he had been proved to murder anyone, because he just stole something from his boss. So
Gotcha.
while Andre was sitting in jail on the theft conviction, something else was happening inside the murder investigation that really shows how badly things had gone off the rails. Police had spent years questioning thousands of people, particularly like sex offenders, psych patients, other men that were suspicious. The interrogation methods they used to profess, like to get confessions, were horrible, because confessions are only good if the person actually did it. Investigators were still getting admissions from vulnerable suspects that didn't line up at all. There was no evidence. Some suspects confessed to crimes while other murderers in the same, like, series continued to happen. So remember that name, Viktor Borakov? He became very skeptical of these confessions. And because every time police, like, were so happy that they found another killer, you know, another body was found like the next day. So Victor was like, you guys, the math ain't mathin'. By 1984, in October, prosecutors formally combined 23 murders into a single case and dropped charges against several mentally disabled young men who had previously confessed to being murderers. Now they believed were all of the same series. So, like, think how fucked up that is. Police had suspects, had confessions. They could have closed the cases, declared victories, and moved on, but the bodies kept, like, piling up. So, you know, there's one man. They finally have 23 people that they're putting together, blah, blah, blah. And Andre knew they had questioned him in the past. They've searched him in the past. They had his blood. They had, well, they had his semen, but they didn't know that. He knew investigators were actively hunting him, or like hunting whoever was leaving these bodies throughout the Soviet Union. But when he had walked out of prison in December of that year, they had failed to identify him. So, like, if you're thinking that being arrested and coming close to that, of being like exposed, must have scared the absolute shit out of him, and maybe he'd stop murdering, you'd be actually right for a little while. Andrei moved to a town of Novocherkassk, found another job that allowed him to travel, of course, and kept a pretty relatively low profile through the first half of 1985. Months passed without another murder. Maybe sitting in a police station with detectives digging through his weird ass bag convinced him that his luck was running out. But then again, August came around and he decided to start killing once again. On August 31st, 1985, just over months after being released from prison, Andrei was traveling for his new job when he arrived in modern day Moscow. If there had been any hope of moving away from Rostov or spending time behind bars, had somehow broken whatever compulsion had been driving him, that hope disappeared almost immediately because while near Domodedovo airport, Andrei encountered an 18-year-old woman named Natalia. So Natalia was alone. Andrei convinced her to leave the area and walk towards the woods. Cool. And once they were away from people, he attacked her, stabbed her repeatedly, leaving her body hidden among the trees. Her remains were discovered days later, but because the murder had happened hundreds of miles away from Rostov, there was no immediate reason for Moscow investigators to even assume that this young woman's death had belonged to the same person back in Rostov. So that was one of the most frustrating advantages that Andrei continued to have. Every time he traveled, he would essentially come across into somebody else's investigation, but they didn't know that. Less than a month later, on September 27th, Andrei was traveling again, this time near the Ukrainian SSR, when he encountered another young woman by the name of Yanessa Galieva near a railway station. Yanessa was 18 years old and reportedly had a history of mental health difficulties, and Andrei persuaded her to walk with him into the woods outside of Shakti before killing her. He killed her, mutilated her, concealed her body beneath branches. Yanessa's body was found the next day, and investigators initially considered the possibility that she had been raped and murdered by someone other than the killer they were hunting. By this point, that uncertainty had become a recurring problem. Investigators knew there was a serial murderer operating across the region, but that didn't mean every person that showed up dead belonged to him, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Then something strange happened, and the murder stopped for a while, but not for a couple weeks, not for a few months, for almost 2 years. And that's one of the most interesting periods in Andrei's story because we don't actually know why he stopped. Maybe the 1984 arrest had frightened him. Maybe he just understood how close police had come to identifying him and he wanted to disappear for a while. Maybe he had a change in work or family. But there's at least one particularly controversial murder from 1986, and that is of 18-year-old Irina. Her body had very similar, was mutilated very similarly to other victims. Investors suspected Andrei, but he initially denied killing her, and later on during his trial said, yes, it actually was him. So, for the investigators, though, Andrei going quiet doesn't mean the case went quiet. They still had tons of unsolved murders, mountains of statements, autopsy reports, witness descriptions, false confessions, forensic evidence, basically everything you could possibly want. It was just such a large geographical area that was their main issue. So by the late 1985, authorities launched what became known as Operation Lesopolusa, which actually translates into Operation Forest Path or Strip. So one of the largest manhunts in Soviet history. The name came from the wooded areas where many victims had been found. At this time, police flooded railway stations, bus stations, and transportation routes were filled with officers. They were questioning travelers, watching sexual offenders, they were following people. And according to the accounts of the investigation, hundreds of thousands of people were ultimately questioned or checked in on, which is that's crazy if you actually think about it.
Yeah, no, that's insane.
And so if you have to say a favorite thing from a story, this would be my favorite because everything sucks about the story. But Andrei apparently helped investigators. At one point during the operation, Andrei participated as a civilian volunteer that assisted police patrols around railway stations. So while the Soviet police were conducting this massive search operation to catch the man who was brutally murdering children and young adults, he was literally standing there, like helping them at the railroads, like searching for himself, which I always love. I love it when a criminal becomes involved in their own case.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know if I could keep myself from doing that. I'd be
I'd
like, how
be
close are
messing
you
around.
guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like tickle tickle, I'm right here. Uh, so honestly, like they that allowed him to see a lot too. So I feel like he definitely got did well while watching all of it unfold almost, you know?
Hmm.
So meanwhile, Viktor Burakov and the investigators closest to the murderers began to realize that like this traditional approach wasn't going to work. They had already interrogated enormous amounts of suspects. They had focused on specific type of people. And so Victor began looking for another way to answer the question that had been driving them nuts. You know, what kind of person could actually be doing this? So that brings in a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky. I'm just going to call him Psychiatrist Alexander into this investigation. Psychiatrist Alexander is fascinating, though, because this is the Soviet Union, you know, in the mid 1980s. And the kind of behavioral profiling that we associate with like the FBI, so, you know, looking at crime scenes, doing victim selection, was not really accepted at this point um, in the Soviet Union. In fact, an entire concept of a sexually motivated serial killer was politically and culturally like very uncomfortable to most people there. But the psychiatrist didn't really care. Children were dead, their killer was free, everything else had failed. So enter Alexander. So the psychiatrist was given access to the case materials and was asked to build a portrait of the unknown murderer. The resulting document was reportedly around 65 pages long and became known as the profile of Citizen X. Rather than imagining some like deranged monster roaming the hills, the psychiatrist argued that the killer was probably completely ordinary looking. They believed that they were looking for a socially inadequate man, probably middle aged, someone who was capable of maintaining a relatively normal public life and might even be married. He believed that the offender's sexual frustration was deeply abnormal and that ordinary intercourse was probably unsatisfying for him. The violence wasn't simply something the killer used to eliminate witnesses after sex, the violence itself was like the sexual aspect. The stabbing, mutilation, domination, and suffering of the victim were what allowed this monster to achieve that gratification that he otherwise struggled to experience.
So
Because
like pretty
spot
um
on.
pretty spot on for the time period of
Mhm.
profiling.
I don't ever get how profiling is done. Like, I think it's just when it's spot on, I don't understand.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me too.
Yeah. So on May 16th, 1987, almost 21 months after Inessa's murder, Andrei was traveling for work when he encountered a 12-year-old boy named Oleg. He was at a railroad station. This was hundreds of miles from Rostov. Andrei persuaded Oleg to accompany him away from the station into a wooded area, killed him. His body would not be recovered at the time, meaning investigators in Rostov had no new body. They didn't know that their killer was active again. Years later, after Andrei's arrest, he actually said, "Oh, hey, by the way, I killed this boy." Like they didn't even know it was him. So during the next several years, boys would make up an increasingly significant portion of Andrei's victims. On July 29th, 1987, he killed another boy, 12-year-old Ivan, in Ukraine. September 15th, he murdered 16-year-old Yuri in St. Petersburg. And once again, Andrei wasn't just operating around Rostov anymore. His murders were appearing across different Soviet republics and regions and separated by huge distances. You know, so by the end of 1987, Andrei had proved something else too. The 2 year break that he took wasn't going to be ending anytime soon. It was just like an intermission, a little 30-minute break. The bodies were going to start reappearing again and again and again. So in April, an unidentified young woman was found murdered near the Kranzy Sulin after being lured off of a train. Her hands had been tied behind her back, dirt had been forced into her mouth, her nose had been cut from her face, ooh, and she had been stabbed repeatedly before being beaten to death with a slab of concrete. So investigators did notice something that they had already connected to the manhunt, and that was the knife wounds. Because remember, they were looking for that specific blade, and he, in his weird backpack, had a 8-inch. But there were also differences. She was not disemboweled like other victims. Her eyes were fine, her genitals were fine, and that was one of the things that just once again got the investigators all in a tizzy because his victims kept changing and what he was doing was still changing. So any uncertainty that the killer had returned disappeared the following month. In May, a 9-year-old named Oleski was murdered in Ukraine. His injuries to his body were very similar to the old ones. July 14th, 15-year-old Yervingeny was disappeared and eventually discovered a few months later. Yervingeny suffered at least 42 stab wounds and had body parts chopped off. In February 1989, Yuri did something that was very unusual for him, though. He brought a victim somewhere connected to his own family. This time, 16-year-old Tatiana Reznova had recently run away from home, and Andrei encountered her at a railroad station. Instead of taking her directly into a forest, he actually brought Tatiana to his daughter's apartment, which was vacant at the time, so I guess he was nearby. There, he murdered her and faced a problem he usually avoided. He had a body inside of an apartment, so he needed to make the body disappear. So he dismembered her, cut out the pieces, carried them, and disposed of them in a nearby sewer. The change in method actually worked in his favor because when her remains were discovered, investigators didn't immediately connect Tatiana to any of the other murders, which kind of makes sense. Andrei killed several more times over the spring and summer of 1989, including children. We've got an 8-year-old in May, a 10-year-old the next month. August was a 19-year-old. Days later was a 10-year-old. Not all of these cases were immediately recognized as belonging to the same offender, which meant investigators were still trying to assemble a puzzle. By this point, the manhunt had been underway for years now, and Viktor Burakov and Mikhail Fedosov were under enormous pressure to explain how a killer could continue operating. Police responded by going back to the place and, connected this extreme amount of numbers of murders to the railroad system. So plainclothes officers were assigned to train stations throughout the Rostov region. Some investigators secretly photographed and filmed passengers. They weren't necessarily looking for someone covered in blood or openly carrying knives. They were more so watching behavior, like they had done before with Andrei, where he was like approaching women or children and stuff like that. So in 1990, an 11-year-old was murdered. In March, a 10-year-old. In April, a 31-year-old. That one was Lyubov Zonova. Lyubov, Andrei convinced her to get off with him at a station into the woods, murdered her. It's absolutely ridiculous how many it's the same thing.
Yeah.
2 weeks later, he murdered an 11-year-old, Ivan, on a beach. It's just ridiculous. At this point, the number of police officers flooding transportation hubs was huge. Basically, every police was on it. In October, 16-year-old Vladimir. 2 weeks later, 16-year-old Viktor. Viktor fought back, though, during his attack, and he actually almost got away, and he bit Andrei on the finger hard enough that it caused a significant wound. Don't get me wrong, Andrei eventually killed him, but that encounter carried an injury that ended up being visible later on when police arrested him. So then came November 6, 1990. Andrei was at a bus station, same kind of area where victims had been attacked. He encountered a 22-year-old woman named Svetlana Korostik. Svetlana was homeless and traveling alone, and Andrei persuaded her to leave the station with him and attacked her later on. Once they were far enough away from the railroad, He attacked, she fought him. It wasn't a quick struggle though, and so she scratched his face. She resisted hard enough, and by the time that he eventually killed her, he had pretty brutal injuries on himself as well, and his clothing was dirty and disheveled. He stabbed her, mutilated her, left her in the woods. When he began walking back towards the railroad, his 12-year-old nightmare finally began to unravel. A police sergeant by the name of Iger was patrolling the area around the station, and this wasn't some coincidence where one random cop was just like wandering around. Officers were specifically trolling places like this because they knew that their killer repeatedly used the railroad systems. Sergeant Iger saw Andrei emerging from the forest and immediately thought, hey, he looks kind of weird. It was a middle-aged man coming out of the woods. His face and clothing were scratched up, dirt everywhere. He wasn't just like taking a stroll. And so the sergeant stopped him.
So kind of weird, yeah.
Just a little weird. But obviously, like looking creepy while out in a forest isn't a crime. He had not seen him attack anyone. He didn't know that a murdered woman was laying nearby. And so at that moment, there was no evidence that Andre had committed an offense. So the sergeant questioned Andre, got his identification, wrote his name down, and let him go. And obviously, like Andre walked away and went home. But the sergeant this time, unlike any other time, did something super important. He filed a report. So investigators had a murdered woman lying nearby, a police report documenting a suspicious man, and they had his name. So they started going through it, got his name, found that he had been questioned before, and then also saw that he was the man who matched the description of that poor 10-year-old stamp boy, Dimitri. The man carrying the knife. He had rope, he had Vaseline. So investigators had seriously considered as their serial killer before, but his blood type wasn't the same. 6 years later, his name had just landed on their desk once again. This time, nobody was going to dismiss him because of a blood test. So on November 14th, investigators quietly placed Andre under surveillance, and for the next 6 days, they watched him. What they followed him on with him is they went to buses and trains, went on his work routes. They watched him walk through public spaces, approach women and children. If one person walked away or refused to engage with him, Andre didn't stop. He just went on to another person. So investigators were essentially watching this hunting behavior that Andre had been doing, and Andre had no idea. On November 20th, Andre left his home carrying a large glass jar, empty, and went into town. He stopped at a kiosk to buy a beer and continued wandering throughout the city with the surveillance team following him. He approached children. He tried to have conversations. He entered cafes. And when he came back outside of one cafe, 4 plainclothes police officers were waiting. They approached him, and after 12 years, more than 50 murders, thousands of interviews, false confessions, an innocent man executed for one of his own crimes, a disastrous forensic mistake, one previous arrest, and one of the largest manhunts in Soviet history, Andre was finally arrested again, but this time he wasn't going to be let go.
Thank God.
So Andre was taken into custody on November 20th, 1990, and was almost immediately being investigated to find little things that made him look worse. When they searched him, they found the knife, the rope. They also noticed injuries that suddenly made a lot more sense. You remember Victor, the 16-year-old that had bit his finger? Apparently Andre never went and got medical treatment for it, so he had that on him. The interrogation began the following day under the investigator Isa Kosayev, and police ended up having a major problem. Believing that Andre did something and proving it are obviously going to be two different things. They could only hold him for a limited period of time before they needed enough physical evidence to charge him. And Andre just sat there and denied everything. So, investigators questioned him about the murders, confronted him with their suspicions, and he was like, nope, wasn't me, didn't do it. So days passed, clock kept ticking, and that's when someone randomly remembered the psychiatrist. Years earlier, psychiatrist Alexander had studied the murders without knowing who the killer was and produced that 60-plus page profile describing almost Andre to a T. It's like he had wrote his biography basically without even
Mm.
meeting him, you know? So on November 29th, 9 days after Andrei's arrest, and with investigators rapidly approaching the point where they formally needed to charge him, the investigators asked Alexander to come in. So the psychiatrist did something different from what Andrei had experienced during the previous days. He didn't like walk into the room screaming. He didn't lay out photographs of dead kids in front of him and ask for a confession. Instead, he sat down and started talking to Andrei. And that's kind of where like the psychiatrist started seeing like, oh shit, this might be the guy of the profile I've been writing about, you know? And within 2 hours, Andrei broke down crying and he started talking. Not to the police, but to the psychiatrist, Alexander. Once he started talking, the scale of what he was describing was way bigger than what the investigators had originally believed. The police had linked their unknown killer to 38 murders. Andrei began admitting to these crimes, describing victims, locations, details, but when formal questioning resumed, he confessed to 36 out of those 38 murders, which obviously like investigators weren't expecting. But even victims, he started describing people he had killed that weren't even on the list. So ultimately, Andrei ended up confessing to 56 murders. Yeah.
Wow,
And
that's insane.
and investigators had to figure out whether he was telling the truth about all of them, which you kind of don't really know. So they began checking his statements against evidence that like only the murderer would know. So during all of these confessions, investigators were finally hearing directly from Andrei about what they were trying to figure out for years. You know, why would he kill people the way that he did? And he told them that it was sexually gratifying. So his inability to perform normally had not disappeared, but during the murders, it essentially would stop because the stabbing, cutting, overpowering, mutilating his victims had become like a sexual act itself. The knife wasn't really a murder weapon after a sexual assault. For him, it was part of the sexual assault. So, eye mutilations also produced one of the strangest details in the case, like I had talked about before. He actually had been, it turns out he had been influenced by an old superstition that the eye of a murderer could like imprint on a dead person's eye. So like he basically thought when the autopsies were gonna get done, like the coroner and everything would be able to show that it was Andre. So like some it was just a stupid superstition.
Okay.
Yeah. So, on April 14th, 1982, a year and a half after his arrest, Andre was brought into the Rostov Provincial Court to answer for 53 murders and additional sexual assaults committed during his teacher career. Now, if you're picturing a normal courtroom where the defendant quietly sat beside his attorney at a table, absolutely not. Authorities knew the family of dozens of murdered children and adults would be sitting only feet away from this man, so they put him in a cage. And this is actually a super famous picture, so you can go look it up and you're going to be like, wait, I've seen this before. There was an actual metal cage that had been constructed inside the courtroom, partially to protect everyone from him, but mostly to protect him from everyone else.
Mm,
The Soviet Union
yeah.
itself had a. Are you looking at the picture?
No, but
Oh,
protect everyone else or t protect him from everyone else. Yeah, because I bet
right.
people wanted to literally kill him.
Yeah, you know, we would if that was my
Yeah.
kid. The trial became a massive, like, media spectacle as normal. Photographs of Andre standing behind those metal bars. His head was shaved. He was staring at, everyone from his little cage. And of course, Andre's behavior during the trial was absolutely insane. He would shout at the judge, he rambled, he sang songs, made strong, strange noises, and he insulted people in the courtroom. At one point, because this trial wasn't already like insane enough, Andre reportedly multiple times during the trial would pull down his pants. Anyways, so this trial lasted for months, and through all of Andre's bizarre performances and attempts to portray himself as crazy or not crazy, everything was ended up being connected to him. So the
Mm.
court ultimately concluded that whatever psychiatric abnormalities that Andre suffered from, he knew he had committed all these crimes. And so on October 14th, 1992, Andrei was found guilty of 52 murders. The following day, the court sentenced him to death. And when the sentence was announced, people in the courtroom applauded. Some relatives were furious that with even that kind of outcome. Andrei ended up appealing, which is crazy. It failed. And then he petitioned for clemency. That failed too. Andrei spent the remaining months of his life in prison, and on February 14th, 1994, Valentine's Day, apparently this story just needed one more weird detail. Guards removed him from his cell. According to the accounts of the execution, he was taken to a soundproof room inside the prison. There was no people watching, there was no victim's family, no courtroom performance, no cage, and Andrei Chikatilo was executed by gunshot. He was 58 years old. The man who had spent 12 years luring children, teenagers, and young adults away from railroad stations, murdering and mutilating them, had ultimately been convicted of 52 people. It was 21 boys, 14 girls, 17 women. His victims had been killed across Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, and investigators still to this day believe that the true number was higher. And while maybe the most disturbing part of the Andrei Chikatilo story isn't simply that one man was capable of doing all of this, it's how many times the system almost stopped him but didn't. After his very first murder, police questioned him, and somebody else actually ended up being executed for him. In 1984, investigators arrested him, searched his weird bag, connected his appearance to a murdered child, and still he was eliminated as their primary suspect because of a forensic blood test. Police investigated thousands of people. Vulnerable men falsely confessed and got in trouble for this. Entire investigative teams were created. Railroad stations were flooded with undercover cops. A psychiatrist essentially described Andrei to a T before investigators knew who they were looking for, and yet he kept killing. Until one police officer standing near a railway station saw a strange, middle-aged man walk out of the woods, thought something didn't look right, and bothered to write down his freaking name. That tiny report eventually made it back to investigators, and 12 years after 9-year-old Lena disappeared first, the Rostov Ripper finally ran out of time. And that is the story of Andrei Chikatilo.
Damn, what a story. That's
Is that not
insane.
one of the craziest stories?
I've never heard of that. I
Nutso.
mean, I guess because it's an international one, we hear about those less, but and it's older too. So,
I've had this one on my list potentially since day one.
well, I can see why you were hesitant about doing it.
I was hesitant for many reasons, and I also kept thinking like I could turn this into a three-parter kind of shit.
Yeah, if you wanted to
And
talk about all of the victims, like one by one, which you obviously don't have time on this podcast to do,
yeah,
um, that's insane. So 56 total, but he was charged for 52.
yes.
Wow.
From what we know.
From what, and that's, there's more.
Yeah. I want you to go look up his picture.
I feel
It's
like
a
he probably
super famous
looks,
picture.
I feel like he pretty much looks like what I thought he would look like
Yeah.
in a way.
Like that's a big famous picture. Yeah.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Oh my gosh, that's insane. Wow.
Sleep well
Well,
tonight.
I mean, if you even get to listen to this, it's probably this make it taking all
Thank
those
you for
issues and
making it
it's
this
finished.
far. Also,
Yeah,
whoever decided to keep going through all the trigger warnings, congratulations.
literally.
It was worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, at least
That didn't sound too confident.
that was a rough one. That was
That
rough.
was a rough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
but good.
so, you guys, because of the sheer epic story of today and its length, we're not going to do an overtime. We love you guys, but I think we can call it quits for today because that was a lot.
Yeah, that was a long one. That
And
was
I'm
a long one,
tired.
but a good
A-
one. Yeah.
And I feel like I could go ace a Russian quiz right now on names.
Yeah, you did really well. And the
Thank
history
you.
lessons that you had were very, very informative.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. So, all right, you guys, with that, thank you for tuning in to another episode if you made it this far. You will catch us next week for another one. Holly's gonna give it to us, but always check us out on our website at overmydeadpod.com. You can also find us on our social medias at overmydeadpod. comment, like, subscribe. Give us your thoughts. Let me know if you've made it this far in this case. I want to know everything. And we will see you guys next week with another episode. Bye.
Bye.